I get quite a lot of questions about topics raised in A Victim Bites Back, and I thought for this show we should look at entertainment, essentially, my involvement in such things. Take Top of the Pops. Now, Top of the Pops was a fantastic show, mainly because it helped boost the sales of music, particularly British music, all around the world for decades, and actually made Great Britain the #1 country for great music for about 10 or 20 years throughout the 60s and 70s, from the middle 60s onwards. I was on that first in 1965 as a teenager, doing Everyone's Gone to the Moon, my first song, which charted at number 19 from nowhere. I remember going on the show and doing the rehearsal, miming as we then did to the song. And at the end of the song, total silence. And I was mortified. I thought, God, I must have been awful. Not realising, of course, that since there was no audience and the only people there were the cameramen and the soundmen and the lighting people and so on and so forth, they were busy doing their job, making sure it looked fine, and they weren't interested in applauding the performance. But I didn't know that. I was just a young university undergraduate doing my first ever national television show with this funny little song I'd written and sang. Anyway, as I stood there thinking, well, that's the end of my career, nobody likes me, this young man walked up to the stage, jumped onto the stage, shook my hand, introduced himself as Cliff Richard, who was already by then the #1 superstar in music in Great Britain, and said, I've got to tell you, I love that record of yours. It's the first one I've bought in years, and I think it's absolutely fantastic. And with a big smile, off he went. And I thought, that is one of the nicest people I've ever met in my life, and I feel that to this day. Ooga chaka ooga 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 chaka ooga 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 chaka ooga 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 chaka ooga ooga.
I can't stop this feeling deep inside of me. Girl, you just don't realize what you do to me. When you hold me in your arms so tight, you let me know everything's alright. What kind of feeling? High on believing that you're in love with me. Lips are sweet as candy, the taste stays on my mind. Girl, you keep me thirsty for another cup of wine. I've got it bad for you, girl, but I don't need a cure. I'll just stay addicted and hope I can endure all the good love when we're all alone. Keep it up, girl. Yeah, you turn me on. What kind of feeling? I'm high on believing that you're in love with me. All the good love when we're all alone. Keep it up, girl. Yeah, you turn me on. What kind of feeling? I'm high on believing that you're in love with me. What kind of feeling? High on believing that you're in love with me. What kind of feeling? I'm high on believing that you're in love.
So then life went on, and I became the most Top of the Pops person other than Cliff Richard himself, who was on again and again and again, and the DJ Jimmy Savile, who started presenting it and was on again and again. And I was on partly because I had lots of hits other than Everyone's Gone to the Moon, some of which I might play you in a moment, but also because then in the 80s and going into the 90s, I was in America and I did a feature called, a series of shows called Entertainment USA, which came out of doing a small segment of 3 or 4 minutes every other week or so on Top of the Pops about the American charts. This was great. We just featured 20, 30 seconds of 2 or 3 hits in America, and it really helped break great music in Britain. More than that, it helped break great British music around the world, because those American artists suddenly had big hits in Britain, came over and did Top of the Pops, saw some of the great British music that was being made in the 80s, went back to America and told all their friends, many of whom were on radio and television there, who then played the British records in America, where they became huge hits, and then they were hits all over the world, and it did the most enormous amount of good. For all these reasons, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and even 90s, Top of the Pops was the most brilliant invention. Why? I'll tell you why. Why was Top of the Pops such a great success? Well, I'll tell you why. It was because from day one, it was based totally on the charts. And the charts were then totally what was popular in the country, because they were totally what people spent their hard-earned pennies from, quite often pocket money, in the record shops. So they went and bought the records they really loved. So Top of the Pops and the charts featured tracks that were genuinely, hugely popular, mass appeal popular, songs and tracks that sold millions. My Everyone's Gone to the Moon on vinyl as a single in 1965 sold 9 million copies. And many, many more on compilations of albums of greatest hits of the era and all that sort of thing. But 9 million singles around the world. These days, it's unbelievable. These days, of course, you get streaming, many more than that, billions, because streaming costs nothing. Streaming marks down a stream when somebody gives it the first 5 seconds and thinks, oh, this is awful, and turns it off. But that's a stream. So actually what looks like billions of streams, A, is actually only a few that people like, and B, doesn't earn much money for anybody, not even the streamers. So times have changed radically. But back in those days, a hit single was really a hit single, and it appealed to grandmothers and small babies and everyone else. Well, I'm afraid I fucked that up. In 1975, I realised that I had a battle on my hands with a song I'd recorded called Una Paloma Blanca. And the original of that was a Dutch record by the George Baker Selection. And it was being played in the clubs in Europe and doing very well. The record company in Britain weren't aware they had a hit on their hands. I was, and immediately did a cover. Actually, I think a better cover. I think my version is better than the original. I put a sort of stepping bass line in that I actually nicked from the old Nancy Sinatra track, These Boots Are Made for Walking. Dum 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 dum. That kind of feel. And I added that to it amongst some other things and made my record. Well, when the record came out, the record label that had the George Baker, Warner Brothers, realised, oh, hang on a moment, we might be beaten by this on Jonathan King's little UK records label, and immediately started pushing their version, which actually they didn't really know how to push, because most people in the music industry were not aware of how to break records. I became very aware this was happening, and was having a long conversation with Clive Selwood, who ran my record label in the 70s, and he said, you know what, there's only about 50 shops who send in their returns for records of tracks that are under the top 50 each week to the compiler of the charts, and only those 50 shops essentially influence what goes into the charts the next week. And he said if we could get to them, we could actually beat the opposition. So I thought that's a very good idea, and sent free boxes of I think about 30 records to each of those 50 record shops, so they didn't have to pay a penny for selling them. They made 100% profit. No money needed to go to the artist, the label, the publisher and everyone else. They were given to them free. They made 100% of whatever they cost, a pound I suppose. So that would actually 30 quid profit they'd make from selling that single, as opposed to the other one where they only made a little tiny amount. Well, as a result, of course, they all sold my version when anyone asked for Paloma Blanca rather than the George Baker one, and I, as a result, beat him into the charts, and actually we chased each other all the way up the chart. I think I ended up as number 3 or 4 on the charts, and he ended up as number 9 or 10, and both records sold a huge amount. But that was the beginning of the rot setting in, because all the other major labels who used to watch little UK records because they knew we were the ones who started a new idea, suddenly it dawned on them, this is a good way to hype our records. And whereas I was very much aware that I would only do that, indeed I could only afford to do that on records that were genuinely going to sell and make me large profits, there was no point in spending £300,000 on a track that was never going to sell properly. But the big record labels were much more interested in records that they got out that had big signings. They paid a fortune in advances to the artists or the producers or whatever, and they needed to make a lot of money back to justify that expense. So as a result, they started hyping those records, which were not genuine hits at all, and they started hyping them by giving much more than free records to the retailers, Rolex watches, all sorts of incredible crates of champagne. These went out to the retailers, all of whom thought, great, I'll put down. They then had to put ticks in a diary. This was the pre-computer days. Ticks in a diary of, you know, how many records they sold. Well, we'll add another dozen to that. If we get a free crate of champagne, why not? Okay, blah, blah, blah. All these actual shit acts who really weren't making decent records, but had a fortune paid by stupid record company executives who thought they were talented. And those all went into the charts. The net result in that, of course, was that Top of the Pops started featuring records which were not actually popular and people didn't actually like. And the ratings began to go down and down and down, slowly but surely.
Do you know what Una Paloma Blanca means? Well, it's funny for a white dove, see? And, of course, it's the big record just now. Oh, oopsie daisy. The big record from the one and only Jonathan King. Thank you. Oh.
Shines on the mountains and the night is on the run. It's a new day, it's a new way, and I fly up to the sun. I can feel the morning sunlight, I can smell the new mown hay, I can hear God's voices calling for my golden skylight way. Paloma Blanca. Yes, they tried to break my power. Oh, I still can feel the pain. Una paloma blanca. I'm just a bird in the sky. Una paloma blanca. Over the mountains I fly. No one can take my freedom away. Yes, no one can take my freedom away. When the sun shines on the mountains and the night is on the run, it's a new day, it's a new way, and I fly up to the sun. Una paloma blanca. I'm just a bird in the sky. Una paloma blanca. Over the mountains I fly. No one can take my freedom away.
So we now move to, I suppose, 1990s, and a new head of light entertainment at the BBC was appointed, a man called David Lidiment. And he was based up in Manchester, and as it happened, I was going to Manchester to do, I think it was In the City, it was a big convention up there, and I was the keynote speaker or the celebrity interview or whatever. So I had to be in Manchester just after he'd been appointed. So I rang him up and said, would he have breakfast with me? He said, yes. We got on like a house on fire. Very bright guy, who incidentally also happened to be a great lover of a rather strange kind of music, of which one of the major bands was Chumbawamba. And he told me about Chumbawamba, and I thought, I was always very inquisitive about new stuff. I thought, that sounds interesting. And I dug out some Chumbawamba tracks that I thought were terrific. And it ended up with me being very involved in Chumbawamba, pushing their tub-thumping track, I Get Knocked Down, But I Get Up Again, which went into the charts and was a huge hit and all that. So that was a big benefit of my friendship with David. But one of the things was, I said to him, look, I've got to take over Top of the Pops. It's a disaster. It's going down and down and down in the ratings. I know exactly why. You need somebody in there who can spot the hype, spot the real hits, get them played, and the ratings will go back up again. And I had a great love for Top of the Pops, having done it for all those years and been on it all the time. So David Lidiment said, okay, I'll see what I can do. They checked it out and said, look, unfortunately, Top of the Pops has been promised to somebody else by my predecessor. Jim Moyer was his predecessor, who I knew quite well. And he'd promised it to a young kid called Rick Blaxill, who was not bad, but just didn't really know how to do it, as indeed most people don't. I underestimate my own ability in certain things. That may sound strange. You may think I go the other way and boost up my abilities. The reality is I do underestimate what I'm good at. One of the things I'm really good at is listening to things, hearing tracks. So as a result, Rick got that job, but David Lidiment said, would I do a job for him that he also really needed doing, please? And I said, yes, why not? What was it? And he said, Eurovision. I thought, He said, look, the ratings are down to nothing. We always come bottom. We haven't won for years and years. So I thought, okay, and I took it on, and indeed enjoyed doing it. Loved actually working on the thing. My favourite entry was my second year, which was a song called Ooh Ah Just a Little Bit by Gina G, which I thought was the perfect Eurovision entry. But it only came 8th or something in the voting. And at that point, I gave up Eurovision and said to the BBC, I can't do any more. If I can't win with that, I won't win with anything. And they begged me to try another year. So I said, okay, gave it another year, worked out it needed a performer because it's a television show, so it's on TV, right? So it's fairly sensible. So as a result, you need somebody who's going to sell it and look great on TV, as well as somebody who can actually make a good record. And that's when we found Love Shine a Light by Katrina and the Waves, and sure enough it won with the biggest 12 points from the available countries at the time there had ever been, and it was enormous and all the rest of it. But moving back to Top of the Pops under Rick Blaxell continued and got worse and worse. More and more hype tracks were featured, ratings went down and down, and as we all know, it then got cancelled. A tragedy. I would have kept it going. What I would have done is I would have actually made sure that America and Australia and certain other points also had almost simultaneous their own Top of the Pops versions, and we all swapped over and played the other ones as well. And I think that would have eventually meant Top of the Pops became a huge international success all over again, but more important than that, sold millions of British records and generally records all over the world. And I think that would have made a huge amount of difference. Top of the Pops would still be on air. The music industry would still be making billions of pounds. The Treasury would still be getting billions in for it. All that would have happened, but it didn't. Top of the Pops got cancelled. As many of you know, since I got out of the music business and indeed got out of prison, I've concentrated on other areas. I've been writing books and I've been making films. And films I think that are great fun to make. I try and make them really cheaply because I don't have any money, basically, but also because I think you can. If you have more imagination, you need less budget. If you do everything you can with as little as possible, you can actually create something that is really better than people who've got loads of money and just don't bother to think about things like the plot or characterization or anything. So I've done that. I started off with a film of mine called Vile Pervert, the musical, which you can still watch for free online and has now had well over 4 million full-length views. And I've been doing that ever since. Lots of my films and things have been going on over the last 20 years. I also go to the cinema a lot, and I like to go to the theatre too. And in fact, I'm just off to see Dr. Semmelweis, which features, for me, the world's greatest actor of the moment, Mark Rylance. It's in the Harold Pinter Theatre, which used to be the Comedy Theatre in Panton Street, and indeed I was involved in a production there way back, I think 1969, when I actually recorded the theme for a show called The Night I Chased the Women with an Eel, which was quite amusingly the show where John Alderton, the actor who was in Please Sir, you might remember him, was also in the show with Pauline Collins, the actress who was known best perhaps for her Shirley Valentine film, and the two of them first met and fell in love. So I loved being back in that theatre for the first time since 1969, and it was fascinating to see. The show is absolutely terrific. I strongly recommend you go to it. It's incredibly choreographed. It is very deep and very intelligent, and really has to be seen. Rylance is fantastic, but all the rest is great as well. It's thoroughly original. I was rather amazed that everybody there seemed to be sort of my age group. I mean, there was white hair or grey hair everywhere. Did make me think, I wonder if young people these days just don't go to the theatre or can't cope with plays that are a little bit deeper. But the other thing I noticed, and you'll have to see it for yourself if you want to understand why, is if the judge and the jury in the Lucy Letby case had seen this show, they would never have found her guilty and would have acquitted her. Now you need to see the show. The other question people ask all the time is, what would I have done had I been chairman of EMI? Well, I've gone through it slightly in some of the earlier versions of this show, but just to encapsulate, the things I suggested when I was offered the part, and they said they'd give me $5 million a year to be global chairman of EMI, and I said, look, this internet thing is catching on a bit. I didn't think it would ever be huge. I didn't think that. I actually said that it will never be more than 5% downloads. Actually, I was proven right, because although for a few years retail sales began to droop and downloads took over, they are now back down to no more than 5%, because everyone is streaming. So times have changed again. But anyway, because I thought downloads would perhaps take over 5%, and that's quite a lot when you're selling billions, right? I was going to start up a download facility, as indeed eventually iTunes did. I was going to start TV and a radio channel online, because the internet was starting to get big in 1999, 2000. And I would play not just only EMI records and tracks, but great tracks of all different sorts of music. And I would build those two up to be the preeminent internet place to go to if you wanted to hear or see great music or great performances. And those were three of the things I wanted to do. I was also going to involve retail in the download process, i.e. make retail for a certain particular deal, i.e. if you went into a shop, they would download the tracks for you onto your laptop or computer or whatever at a lower price than you'd be paying if you went normally, because we'd have done a deal. But secondly, they would also then have said, by the way, if you like Bruce Springsteen, have you heard Tom Petty? And things like that would have actually enhanced the breadth of people getting into certain sorts of music. You like country and western? If you quite like Taylor Swift, you might like Garth Brooks, that sort of thing. Anyway, those were some of the things I'd have done with the music industry had I not been stopped in my tracks by the combination of Surrey Police and Max Clifford in the year 2000.